All right, everybody. Well, thanks for coming. Now that Mick Supernalda's here, we can begin. Just kidding, man. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. I know with the Infringement Festival and the nude bike ride going on, you all had a lot of choices about how to spend your Saturday, but you chose to spend it with us, so thank you.
Yeah.
I've been looking forward to this event for a long time. It feels like I've been looking forward to this event for almost a decade now, because I think roots of this conversation reach back at least that far for me and for others much further. We're going to hear today from two visitors to Buffalo for the first time for both of you, right?
Yes.
Yeah, first time visitors to Buffalo. They picked the right month to come here.
Oh boy, did they.
Yeah. So on my left here is Leo Lensing. He is a Foundlings Press author of Subiaco's Unofficial Poet Laureate, which just came out in a second expanded edition, and you can get here tonight. Leo was a high school classmate of the poet Frank Stanford's, and that's the subject he chose to write about in that book, though he's also a distinguished film critic and scholar of German culture and other things. So after this, you can talk to him about things that have nothing to do with Frank Stanford if you wish.
I have Metropolis questions.
Great.
I might be able to answer them. Who knows? I'll do my best.
To Leo's left is James McWilliams, coming here from Texas, a distinguished historian who has been working on a biography of Frank Stanford for how many years did it take?
I think I was working on it before I knew I was working on it, so if you include those years, about 10, let's say.
Yeah.
About 10.
Yeah. This is one of those books that sneaks up on you and hits you over the head, hit James over the head, I think, and hit me over the head recently. It's a wonderful experience. These are two extraordinary books. I don't want to talk too much about them, but I will just say this. I think both of the works go beyond mere memoir or biography, deep into broader cultural history and criticism. They illuminate the work of Frank Stanford in a way that I found to be just invaluable. So first, thank you. Thank you both. Both Leo and James are going to read from their books first, and then we'll have a little conversation. I think I'll get it started, but then turn it over to all of you, and it'll be free-flowing. So I think first off will be Leo.
Thanks. Thanks to Fitz Books, especially the waffles. I haven't tried them yet, but looking forward to it one of these days. So I saw Frank Stanford for the last time on May 27th, 1966, the day we both graduated from Subiaco Academy in Subiaco, Arkansas. Subiaco is a tiny town. It's mostly the Abbey and the Academy, about 50 miles from Fort Smith, which is on the Oklahoma border. Afterwards, I had no contact with Frank before his death in 1978, and was not even aware that he had died until 2003, when I read an article about his friend and co-publisher, the poet C.D. Wright. In 2011, after being convinced by a crazed fellow alumnus to attend the 45th reunion of the class of 1966, I retrieved my Subiaco yearbook, which was called The Pax, as in peace, The Pax, from the attic, and discovered that Frank Stanford had written me a farewell note. I have no idea if I read it before that. I think I probably didn't. I probably just put it away. And that's what led to this little book. And thanks to Aiden now for taking a risk on me, not once, but twice. I really appreciate it. And to Darren Canham, too, for being patient and creating a great cover, and also tremendous typography in the book. So I wanted to start by reading two of the three mottos that I gave to the book, because they give a sense of Stanford's connection to Subiaco, the institution, and its impact on his life and work. And then I'm going to read part of the section that I call Reading and Writing. So the first motto is taken from a letter that Frank wrote to Alan Dugan, the poet, well-known, not so well-known to me, but an important poet, Alan Dugan, in 1971. And Frank writes, "I went to the Benedictine monastery to school. That is where I learned a lot. There wasn't anything else to do." And then a couple of lines from Frank's poem Instead, which was first published in 1974. "When the rest of you were being children, I became a monk to my own listing imagination. And with children, I think he means us, the other students, the other seniors in the class. Okay, so I'm going to read the section about writing rather than the section about reading, because I think that James actually found out more about what Frank might have been reading at Subiaco than I was able to from most of the book. Most of what I have in the book is taken from conversations I had with classmates over the last decade, 12 or 13 years actually, and from written sources, printed sources at Subiaco in the archives. So only a handful of our Subiaco classmates with whom I have spoken over the last dozen years remembered anything specific about what Frank might have been reading and writing, or that he even considered himself a poet. Father Nicholas Furman, who will be introduced in more detail later, Father Nicholas Furman told me he could not recall reading anything by Frank other than assignments for a senior English class. He did tell me that he excused Stanford from mandatory study hall attendance and PE classes, that seems unfair, so that he could pursue writing, about which, however, the young writer remained secretive. Perhaps in order to compensate for this gap in his knowledge of the biographical record or in his memory, I was talking to him in his mid to late 80s. Furman was fond of telling a story, as he did to others and to me in 2011 in person and in a later letter, about Stanford's reaction to a lecture in which the periodization of English literature was laid out. So this is Father Nicholas. I had been giving an overview of the centuries of English literature, summarized as Beowulf, Old English, Chaucer, Middle English, Shakespeare, Modern English, and a few contemporary poets such as Hopkins, Eliot, and Pound. As he was leaving the classroom, Stanford is supposed to have remarked, "I wish it were that simple." Father Nicholas told this anecdote over and over again. And as Freud would say, there was a reason for that, I'm sure. This anecdote reflects Father Nicholas's persistent doubts about whether Stanford had actually learned anything from him at all. He wrote to me in 2016 that, and I'm quoting, "I almost felt hypnotized by the way Frank sat straight up about 2 seats down from me and just looked at me, did not write anything down." Later, Bill Lux, and now most of the names that come now are the names of fellow seniors in the class of 66. Later, Bill Lux would assure Father Nicholas that Frank, even if he was not taking notes, behaved differently in his English class, demonstrating there at least the academic attentiveness that David Loy, so another student, stressed in his conversations with me. It's amazing that these people remembered these things about Frank. I mean, I was really blown away by the details that they gave me. Bill Lux also remembered a specific moment when he, Stanford, and others entered the classroom quietly and found Father Nicholas looking out the window and reciting Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, an action that apparently transfixed and entranced the young poet. This is something that Bill Lux remembered. So biographical accounts of Stanford's high school years contain few specifics about his reading, but debate continues over whether he had begun to write in earnest at Subiaco. I think James may have finished the debate in his book, we'll see. He may speak to that. Given his now well-documented tendency, that is Frank's well-documented tendency to exaggerate and prevaricate, there's been particular skepticism about the copyright dates printed in his first book, The Singing Knives, which came out in 1972. And that book has copyright dates of 64, 65, and 66. Those would have been the years that he was a junior and senior at Subiaco. So some of these poems were probably written there, and I found a handful of classmates who had distinct memories of Frank actually writing them there, which I think we didn't know before that, at least not with any certainty. David Loy can recall precisely the layout of the triple room that Frank shared with Bob Schulte and Kevin Griesmer, who both happened to be from Missouri. Frank's desk was the farthest from the door and stood in front of a window with a shelf full of, quote, thick tomes. Frank was probably the only Subiaco student who had thick tomes anywhere near his desk. When he visited the room, when David, Loy, visited the room, there were often manuscripts on the desk, and Frank never hid the fact that he was writing. Loy remembers seeing verse, not rhymed, he added, and handwritten, not typed. Kevin Griesmer told me that Frank wrote all the time and that he was in the habit of reading his work aloud to him and Schulte. Reading the published poetry now, Griesmer said he remembered thinking at the time that the simple syntax and colloquial style, which describes most of the verse in The Singing Knives, made the poem something anybody could write, even if they could not or would not reproduce the content. At the time, to goad Frank, he told him, "You're just pulling this stuff out of the air and throwing it at the wall to see if it sticks." Bill Lux, another frequent visitor to the room, remembered Frank once saying to him, "Listen to this," and getting out 4 lines of poetry before Bill Money, another student, and Schulte pelted him with pillows. Bob Schulte, whom I just found last year and was able to get information from him for the second edition. Schulte had a very precise recollection of Frank writing, sometimes working on 5 to 10 poems at a time. And far from hiding his work from his roommates, he would occasionally give Schulte and Griesmer poems to read, which they then claimed gave them headaches. Schulte liked to retaliate by hiding Frank's manuscripts or reciting TV cartoon lyrics in response. He was particularly fond of declaiming the signature lines from Tudor Turtle, one of the segments in King Leonardo and His Short Subjects, which was on television from 1960 to 63. And Bob Schulte quoted those signature lines to me last year on the phone. I will now quote them to you. "Drizzle, drazzle, drazzle, drone, time for this one to come home." I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember. Yes.
It was part of the Underdog series. I never liked it, but I know of it.
Yeah, the King Leonardo. I mean, probably because of the name. I loved the series when I was a kid. But anyway, this drove Frank, who, like most of us, had undoubtedly watched the popular cartoon on Saturday mornings and could not get the catchy tunes and silly rhymes out of his head, to distraction. He would shout back, "You don't know shit about poetry." Schulte remembered too, however, how devoted Frank was to his work, that he would suddenly break away from a group walking down the hall, saying he had to rush back to their room and write down verse that had suddenly come to him. He also thought that while Frank looked up to Father Nicholas, whom he considered a mentor, he never shared his poetry with him during his high school years. But coming back to other witnesses, both Lux and Louis, so Bill and David, insisted in conversations with me that Stanford did show Father Nicholas his writing and solicited a critique or at least a response from him. In an undated typescript detailing the history of his writing, Frank himself remarked, and I quote, "Ask Nick," which is what we called him behind his back. "Ask Nick. I had written a poem on every English and European form by graduation." These statements contradict Furman's own recollections, of course, but there's not only a certain personal logic to it. As Joe Saunders, who's a classmate of ours who's passed away sadly, wrote to me, Frank was a nice guy who kept himself alive with the intellectual relationship with Nick. In other words, there were no other peers at Subiaco, really, that he could relate to. But in addition to the personal logic, there was an institutional one as well. In addition to being our English 4 teacher, Father Nicholas was the faculty supervisor of the school paper, The Periscope. And together with the student editors, always on the lookout for more material to satisfy the insatiable beast, his unforgettable term for a publication habitually short of copy. I know because I was the editor my senior year. The quality of Frank's writing, even if demonstrated only in class assignments, will not have escaped Father Nicholas, and it seems likely that he would have tried at least to convince him to work for the paper. Frank's poems, however, if he had been willing to part with them, would have been unprintable in the Periscope. But the more or less common knowledge that they existed found its way into their pages. In the April 1966 issue, Jim McDaniel wrote a profile of Frank that appeared in the column Subiaco and its students. And I'm going to read, it's like 7 or 8 lines. I'm going to read the entire profile to you. Frank Stanford, a senior from Mountain Home, Arkansas, is Subiaco's unofficial poet laureate. Frank is also noted for some prose, though he does direct most of his madness to the less inhibited medium of poetry. Frankie is also captain and instructor of Subiaco's judo team along the athletic line. Asked if he could really kill a person with his little finger, he replies by breaking your neck in 2 or 3 places. Most people who have made the query find some satisfaction in knowing he used his whole hand. So even seniors could write in a sophomoric mode, as you can see. In keeping with the whimsical tenor of McDaniel's pen portraits, he here mixes verifiable fact, Stanford's involvement with judo, with more or less fanciful embellishments. In 2011, McDaniel told me he could not remember how he came up with the great honorific unofficial poet laureate. And he didn't even remember knowing anything about Frank's writing at all. But obviously, that was an important clue for me, and James also found this, I think, in the school paper. We were both, excited to see it there. By contrast, Bill Money, who, by the way, was a student from Mississippi and a friend of Frank's, both from his days as a very young kid in Greenville, Mississippi, and then in the summers, Bill Money and Frank saw each other. Bill Money said that he did remember reading short poems that he said the supposedly secretive author had pressed on him. In 1998, he told Murray Sugars, the author of an early dissertation on Stanford, that he never saw a long poem and remembers no mention of one. However, in a conversation I had with Money a dozen years later, he said that reading Father Nicholas's notes on Sugars' dissertation had jogged his memory. He was now certain that he had not only read excerpts, but also heard Frank reciting passages from a long poem that may well have been St. Francis and the Wolf, an early version of the great epic poem, The Battlefield, Where the Moon Says I Love You. When Stanford asked Bill Money, his Mississippi buddy, what he thought about his work, Money remembered telling him that it was the craziest shit I've ever seen. And he actually verified that when I talked to him a couple of years ago. He still had the same opinion. John Casey, who was the only student I mentioned who was a junior when we were seniors, he wrote for the Periscope and later became a high school English teacher in Fort Smith, Arkansas, remembered a visit from Stanford sometime during the school year after we graduated in May of 1966. In a letter that Casey wrote to me in 2011, there's a description of an encounter in which the unofficial poet laureate finally emerges, although not in the way we would have hoped for, perhaps, as you'll see. Frank came by my dorm room in the old building at Subiaco when I was a senior. He left me a brief poem written on the spot, which, damn my eyes, I lost. It was scotch taped to my ceiling for a spell. I remember the first and the last line, and I quote, "There is spit dripping down the hot pipe. I done it. I don't know why I do these things. I just do them," unquote. As far as I've been able to determine, John Casey would become, together with Kevin Griesmer, who I mentioned was one of the senior roommates, one of only 2 fellow students to whom Stanford gave one of his books. He told Casey, and I quote for the last time, he told Casey it would be better to read the poems on the commode. So, the commode is a southern term for the toilet. Okay, that's all I've got.
Yeah. Thanks, Leo. Yeah.
All right. Well, I have to say, listening to Leo read that section, I'm reminded how I could not have written chapter 5 of my book without the research that Leo did. And so don't let the gentlemanly attire fool you here. He's a vicious private investigator, okay? This guy did amazing research and then shared it with me. And so I'm really grateful for that. But the other thing I was thinking when you were reading is just what a sad contrast it's going to be to what I'm getting ready to read. Because, here at Stanford, at a kind of an innocent moment in his life, a time in his life, 2 years where he's really discovering his poetic talents and his poetic voice and becoming rewarded for it. I mean, before Stanford went to Subiaco, he was living in Mountain Home, and he had the same literary and poetic obsessions, but he had to hide them because in Mountain Home, this did not translate very well into coolness. But at Subiaco, there was a more tolerant environment. So it's a really happy time for him in many ways. Most people who know Frank Stanford, or know of Frank Stanford, of course, know that he committed suicide, and in a particularly dramatic way. And, as I sat down to think about how to arrange the biography, it's in chronological order with one exception. I thought, I'm just going to begin with the end and get that out of the way and address this myth of his death, and address the myth with as much factual information as I can find. And so I spent a great deal of time, an inordinate amount of time, an insane amount of time, trying to pin down every detail leading up to his death to, in one sense, sort of kind of knock the mythical shine off of it, and in another sense, to just kind of get this event out of the way so we can get to the life, because the life was truly amazing. And so I'm going to read that opening section. It takes about 10 or 11 minutes. The opening quote is from a Frank Stanford poem called Lost Dog and a Wild Hare. Death doesn't fuck around. Early morning, June 3rd, 1978, an uptown New Orleans house at 519 Webster Street. Frank Stanford got out of bed, went into the bathroom, and wrote in black ink a message on the wall, just above a tacked-up poster of Michelangelo's The Last Judgment. What is Frank looking for? He got dressed, took $10 and an old suitcase that belonged to his friend and fellow poet Ralph Adamo, in whose house he had just slept. After packing his clothes, Frank went to meet the writer, Ellen Gilchrist, for breakfast. They ate on Magazine Street, possibly at Tranchina's. "This is goodbye," Frank said to her after breakfast. "This is really goodbye." Then Kay Duvernay, a poet and photographer with whom Frank had spent the night, picked him up and drove him to the airport to fly home to Fayetteville, Arkansas. What was Frank Stanford looking for? Impossible question. Nobody will ever fully know. But on that morning, at least, he wanted an escape. Typically, escaping was something he did well. Frank escaped having to ask his friend Ralph for money. He escaped whatever expectations Duvernay, a woman who Frank had known for many years, might have entertained about the poet she had loved through the night. But most notably, Stanford, by sojourning in New Orleans for over 2 weeks, had escaped facing in person the anger of his wife, Jenny Crouch Stanford, and his lover, C.D. Wright. Because the jig was up. A day or two after Frank left for his trip to New Orleans on May 18th, the two women had discovered that they'd been deceived by the handsome and charismatic poet. Frank had told Jenny that his relationship with C.D. was a working relationship, and he had told C.D. that his marriage with Jenny was one of convenience. But the facts were otherwise. He was in love with and sleeping with both women, and now these women were letting him know that they knew. They were also making it clear that he would suffer consequences. When C.D. and Jenny met at a mutual friend's house in Fayetteville to discuss the matter, they were, according to this friend, holding each other up for support, and they were really angry. Frank Stanford was not eager to head back home, whatever that word now meant to him, into a maelstrom of emotion. He must have known the discovery was going to happen. Jenny had evidently found love letters he'd written, presumably to Wright. and a file of his poems, to which she had ready access. It felt, Jenny later recalled, like the end of the world. Almost 20 years later, Wright remembered Jenny's immediate response to her discovery of the evidence. Within 2 hours, she was at my door. Frank had kept these two talented and intelligent women in the dark about each other, or at least about the nature of his relationship with them, for nearly 2.5 years. Ginny and CD bonded in their pain and desire for retribution. There was a lot of tenderness between them, recalls the friend whose kitchen they met in. We talked for the next 2 weeks, and there was a lot of driving back and forth, Wright said about her meetings with Jenny, who was living in southern Missouri. As they waited for Stanford to return, the two women planned a reckoning. Once the legendary poet returned to Fayetteville, mustering whatever it took to come through the door at 705 Jackson Drive, he would face that which he had always had a complicated relationship, reality. So on this morning of June 3rd, 1978, standing in Ralph Adamo's bathroom, Stanford was in an unprecedented position. The poet was trapped. Reality, something he'd long eluded, or at least kept at bay, now had him in a vice. No artifice, much less art, could free him. For perhaps the first time, Stanford finally knew the answer to the question he had written on the wall that morning. He may have even penned those words as his epitaph. In the lead up to this moment, Stanford had twice delayed his flight home. On May 31st, he had written to his mother, "I'm fine and having a very good time. This New Orleans is a wonderful city, full of wonderful people." Frank had gone to the coast with friends to a town called Pas Christian, and possibly others. On June 2nd, back in New Orleans, he'd spent the night at Adamo's house with Duvernay, who thought Frank was, and this was a Hoe and Gilchrist quote, "full of holy water." At some point on June 2nd, Frank had arranged to have flowers sent to Lucinda Williams, a woman he had only known for a few months, but who notes in a draft of her memoir, "I was enamored of him. I was in love with him." On June 3rd, after breakfast with Gilchrist, Stanford took an 8:45 a.m. flight to Little Rock, where he transferred to a 1 p.m. flight to the Northwest Arkansas Regional Airport. He opted for window seats. It was most likely on this plane where he wrote on a white legal pad, I would not be honest if I said I was just totally free of fear and sadness. There is sadness, and there is fear. After being picked up at the airport by his friend Sherman Morgan, he arrived home at 705 Jackson Drive in the mid-afternoon. The rental was a small ranch house at one end of a quiet street. Honeysuckle vines threaded through a chain-link fence. The lawn was freshly cut and manicured. In the covered garage stood the bulky hardware of the literary press, White River Printers, that he and Wright ran together. Between the garage and the house stretched a laundry line, to which the pages of poetry books were pinned to dry, before being bound into volumes that launched the careers of other young poets, many of whom Frank had selflessly nurtured into maturity. As Frank approached the front door, he saw in his white 1977 Datsun pickup a foreboding tableau of objects. From the rear-view mirror hung a pair of woman's underwear and cut-up pieces of his father's Stetson hat. Below it was a cover of a Lightning Hopkins album. This was a dark shrine designed to haunt and mock the man for his infidelities, his uncontrollable passions, his lies. It was to presage the spite and rage, as Jenny put it, he was about to face. When he entered the house, Frank Stanford encountered two deeply pained women. Ginny later recalled that he had on a new white shirt and khaki pants and was tan from his beach venture. His face looked thin and, quote, he had the distant air of a man just back from war. Frank tried to hug Jenny, but she refused him. He told her he loved her, but for the first time, she did not respond. His belongings had been shoved into boxes. Jenny affirmed that she had filed for divorce. From home and marriage, Frank Stanford was now estranged. Then came the fight. We had this verbal showdown, the three of us for hours, Wright recalled. Soon she was vomiting in the bathroom and Jenny was sobbing in the kitchen. The emotions continued to mount. I wanted to put him through a wall, Jenny said in a written account of that day. Then, as she later put it, we proceeded to slice and dice him. At this point, around 6 p.m., Frank, who had spent his entire life avoiding confrontation, said he needed to go to his office at the surveying company where he worked. In his absence, paperwork had piled up and he needed to check in, he said. They made the 2-mile drive to the office at 118 West Center Street. C.D. Wright said it was just her and Frank in the truck, in his truck. Jenny said it was the three of them. Either way, both women agreed how strange it was for Frank to later leave the office wearing a red hoodie, sweatshirt, his head down, and his hands jammed in the big front pocket. Not long after the return to 705 Jackson Drive, Frank said he needed to rest for a while and went to the bedroom right off the kitchen, shut the door, and lay down on the bed he had shared with C.D. for nearly 2 years, a bed that had once belonged to her grandmother. Minutes later, the phone rang in a hallway about 5 blocks away. Jim Whitehead, a former teacher of Frank's and a founder of the MFA program at the University of Arkansas, walked from his home office, the very spot where Frank and C.D. had met less than 3 years earlier, to answer it. His daughter was in the house at the time and remembers her dad picking up the phone, pausing, and yelling as loud as she had ever heard the big man yell, "God damn it!" before rushing out of the house. What Jenny had heard from the bedroom around 7 p.m. sounded like Frank was hitting something with a piece of wood. She later described what Frank did to himself with the .22 revolver he'd taken from his boss's desk and hidden in his hoodie. Quote, "In the span of the longest 5 or 6 seconds I have ever lived through, Frank fired 3 shots into his chest, 3 pops, 3 cries. After the 3rd cry, I knew he was dead." Jenny ran across the street for help while C.D., standing over Frank's body, screamed and screamed. When Jenny came back, she straddled him, pumping his chest, while C.D. breathed into his lifeless lungs. Jenny recalled that his eyes turned from hazel to porcelain green. She remembered thinking, "This is real. This is real. This is real." Sorry, that's not very exciting. I've never read that aloud. It's like, oh, man.
Yeah. Well, and this is just the beginning of your tour. You're going to have to do that a lot. Thank you, though. That was really, really incredible. I like how you framed that as something that in some ways we need to get out on the table and then get out of the way to talk about the life. And I think that's exactly what I want to do now. And I want to start actually with geography, in part because of where we are and where you're visiting. There's a line that jumped out at me in the preface of your book, where you're talking about a letter that Stanford writes to the poet, I believe, Richard Eberhardt.
Yeah.
And he's talking about his relationship with literary contemporaries and literary institutions in a really interesting way. He's joking about how he's not interested in Yaddo. He's joking about, bread loaf. He says, maybe I should go for one of those Guggenheim things. And then I want to get this quote exactly right and then ask you about it. You point out that the language itself seems to distance him from ambition emphasizing the cultural gap between Fayetteville and the Northeast. I thought that was a really great insight, and partly because we are in the Northeast, and Stanford, through your biography, is entering a different kind of conversation. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, his relationship with his contemporaries and the institutions of poetry at the time.
I mean, it was double-edged. He really valued the fact that he wasn't in New York, and he valued the fact that he wasn't a member of the literary community, the in group, as it were. But he was also resentful of it at the same time. And I think what Frank wanted was ideally to be deeply respected by that literary community while being able to play the role of the wild poet living in the backwoods of Arkansas, because he really valued that image of himself, and he promoted that image of himself. And it wasn't disingenuous. He loved living in Northwest Arkansas. He loved living kind of off the formal literary grid. And he went to New York for a month, and he really didn't care for New York that much. He saw a ton of movies, but the elitism and the posturing of the literary community deeply grated against him. And I mean, I think a good way to kind of wrap this answer up is to highlight something that he tried in 1975, and that was to publish in the pages of Esquire about as insider as you can get in terms of the elite New York literary community. And Gordon Lish was interested in a short story that he had sent, and oh my gosh, for 6 months it was Gordon Lish saying, almost there, almost there, almost there, not quite there, not quite there. And Frank going and spending 5 straight days not sleeping and rewriting a story and trying it again and not getting it and not getting it, nibble after nibble after nibble. And then eventually Frank sort of erupted in a emotional "fuck you, Gordon Lish," which many people should, I think, have said, and more people probably should say. And sorry, and then, but so he wanted that, like he wanted to be in there, and then he didn't want to actually move to New York and play the social game that required to get into that community. He wanted to be valued as an outsider, and he really liked saying "F you, Gordon Lish," and he did so in a poem that he wrote later, where he said, "I've tried Esquire, but my shoes aren't big enough," or something to that effect.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Yeah. And Leo, I was curious if you had a perspective on this too, in part because you knew Frank at a time when his interests were becoming global, and I want to talk a little bit more about that later. But then also because you yourself moved to the Northeast and left the Arkansas environment. Do you have any insight into how Frank thought about that, maybe even as early as in high school?
Well, I guess I know a few things from listening to my classmates and also from reading James's research in his biography. One thing that interested me is I certainly did not know anything about Buddhism in high school and had not gotten interested in Japanese culture, which I did very soon after I left Subiaco. So it was fascinating to me that Frank, he was not only doing judo and karate, he was reading Buddhist texts. He was fascinated by Japanese warrior poets. And I mean, I'm addicted to Japanese woodblock now myself, but at the time, I didn't really understand the connection. So that is something that was clearly happening there. That he would develop, and I think probably deepen his work in a way that might not have happened otherwise. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we had in common shortly after high school, and this is something that in a sense brought him back to the Northeast, or at least to the aesthetic ethos of the Northeast, was his interest in cinema, in European cinema. And I got to know a lot more about German cinema in particular later on, but I was at Cornell in graduate school, and they had a fantastic film series, and I realized Frank and I were seeing a lot of the same films, by Fellini, Bertolini, and others who were very important to me at the time, and obviously important to Frank too, because he wrote poems that were based on films, or sometimes they were, I think, just homages to the directors themselves, to the work of the directors. So, I mean, presumably at Subiaco, up until 1966, he wasn't seeing those films, but very soon after, we were doing similar things without knowing it. And we were both reading Yukio Mishima, which freaks me out when you found that, or when there was a reference somewhere. And I still have, I think it's called The Sound of the Waves. It's not one of his more radical works, but Frank and I were apparently reading that at the same time. So that was an interesting discovery for me.
It's really interesting. Maybe staying on the subject of influences for a minute, because you both sort of brought us there. One of the most cited influences and comparisons, I think, made around Stanford's work, in particular as it relates to the battlefield, is, of course, Faulkner, because of this sort of sprawling imaginarium set in the South. And I want to talk about influences further afield, but Leo, can you contextualize for us, a Buffalo audience in 2025, where Faulkner was situated in the kind of mental and intellectual landscape of a high school boy in Northeast Arkansas in 1960-something?
That's a great question.
It's a tall order there.
Yeah.
I knew who Faulkner was. I had started to read Faulkner. This is another interesting parallel. Frank supposedly read all of Faulkner before he ever got to Subiaco, so that would have meant before he was 16. And I believe he did. I have no trouble believing that he did it. I was certainly not reading Faulkner with that intensity, but Faulkner was a known quantity to me. I mean, he was a kind of myth, and he could do no wrong, and apparently he actually could do a lot of wrong, as we found out. Michael Gora's book, I think, right, about the lost cause, with the title "The Lost Cause." So I was very into Faulkner, and by the time I was 20, I had read a lot of the novels, because I was studying German in Innsbruck, Austria, and very homesick. And it was a perverse thing to do, but I read Faulkner, in order not to be homesick anymore. So, Frank said, I think, to Bill Willett that he wanted to be the Faulkner of poetry. And, you can't help, when you read The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You, you can't help but think of Faulkner's, rhythms, and also we've already talked this evening about his lack of punctuation. Faulkner also left out a lot of commas as time went on. So, there was again, I think Faulkner was a kind of god in the South back then, in the literary South. He could, in a sense, do no wrong, and Frank probably felt that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd add two things to that. I mean, one, Frank's interest in Faulkner began young. I mean, he began at 13. He started reading Faulkner at 13, and that might sound ridiculous, but growing up in the South, in Atlanta, in ninth grade. How old are you in ninth grade? I guess you're older than 13, but we read The Bear in ninth grade in Atlanta, and so it's not that unusual that he would have been exposed to Faulkner, in my mind, in the 50s, in the early 60s, rather, in Mountain Home. But there's a couple of other things to keep in mind about Frank and Faulkner. I mean, he deeply admired Faulkner, and you get a Yoknapatawpha sort of quality to the characters who reappear throughout his poetry, much as they do in Faulkner's oeuvre. But his mother's best friend was Joan Williams, and Joan Williams was distinguished. She was a distinguished novelist, but the other thing that distinguished her is she had a long-term affair with Faulkner, and so she came to visit the house all the time. And Frank was enamored of Joan Williams, not just because she was a novelist, but more so because she had this connection to Faulkner. And so I think that in some ways tightened his connection to Faulkner. The other thing is that, Frank had spent as many of you might know already, he spent his youth over the summers going to these levee camps.
Yeah.
And because his father was a levee engineer. And so his friends at the levee camps were all black kids, because his father was a boss. They were the only white family there. And Frank, at the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, is getting immersed into this vernacular that he was very comfortable with. And his close friends were these kids, and he stayed friends with them over time. And so I think when Frank read Faulkner, that he acknowledged and admired the fact that Faulkner was addressing race, but I think that he also was deeply aware that Faulkner was acknowledging race, but he wasn't really getting it from the perspective of black Southerners. And I think Frank felt like, because of his background, because of his experience, not just as a kid, but when he got to Fayetteville, he started hanging out at Sherman's Tavern, which was the first black-owned business, and almost all black patrons there, and he was usually the only white guy there, and he felt much more comfortable in that environment. And so when Frank was writing The Battlefield, I think he was also realizing, I can do better than Faulkner in some ways in terms of presenting the social complexities of race. I think he had this notion that he could do it from a more genuine, authentic perspective than Faulkner was ever able to do.
Yeah.
And I think he did. I mean, personally, I think he did.
James, was he pretty well accepted by the black community at the time?
Thoroughly. I found guys who hung out with him in Sherman's and said he came in, he listened, he was soulful, he was quiet. He did much more listening than talking in that setting. And when you read The Battlefield, you can understand that. You can appreciate that listening.
I'm glad you brought this up, and actually, it makes sense that he would have said his ambition was to be the Faulkner of poetry to Bill Willett, because that would have probably placed that comment a little bit earlier. I feel like his ambition grew to be much larger than that, right?
He later said, "I'm going to whip Faulkner."
Yeah. On the subject of race, I'm glad you brought that up. It's something I really, really wanted to talk about, because I think one of the great contributions of both of your books is to deepen our understanding of Stanford's relationship with race. My own experience of reading Stanford and being a part of a community of people that read Stanford is that in previous years, this discussion was pretty surface level. There was an acknowledgement of his access to a black vernacular, and then there was the acknowledgement of what The Battlefield is doing on some level, which is this sort of exuberant rejection of the lost cause mythology and this kind of imagining of a different South. But you both find out and delve into what was going on in the middle in those high school years, where there's a lot of problematic behavior going on, and Stanford is flirting with this lost cause mythology. And I love that you both just addressed that head on. And because you didn't read from that section, I wonder if you both could talk a little bit about that in the context of this.
Leo really pioneered this, I have to say.
Well, his high school period would coincide with the high point of the civil rights movement, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And we were all. I do talk about that in some detail in the book. The reason that I decided to write the memoir after I read the little dedication in my yearbook was that I talked to a student, Jim McDaniel, the guy who wrote the profile, calling Frank the unofficial poet laureate, and he told me a story about a class report that Frank gave in what had been a Christian doctrine course, quote unquote, but had been modernized under the influence of a Chicago Catholic organization into a pretty sophisticated course having to do with civil rights, human rights, and other topics that were, had nothing to do directly with theology, which is what we normally would have studied in that course. And Frank gave this report. I mean, I think I don't want to go into great detail, but he gave a report in which he basically argued for white biological superiority. And one of my classmates remembered he actually had illustrations, and he even used some of the scientific terminology that was used at the time to justify this attitude. I'm still shocked that I don't think I was in the classroom. I can't remember it, and apparently some of us, most of the seniors would have been there, and I talked to 4 different seniors they remembered different details, but they remembered what a shock it was to listen to this, and to have the fucking priest say nothing. They didn't call him on the carpet. They didn't criticize him in the class. And as far as I know, he was never disciplined for it afterwards either. So that shocked me, and that got me to talking to other students about other. There were other incidents. I would say that, in general, Frank really was. He lived by a sort of Mississippi racialist ethos back in those days, and there wasn't a lot of subtlety about it. I mean, that's just the way he behaved. And one could give other examples. There are other examples, but it's also amazing how he changed. Right, once he got to Fayetteville, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you know a moment in which
Oh, sure.
in which he actually things turned around, but he was a dyed-in-the-wool racist. You have to say it at that time.
And I mean, I think we have to add here, it was his family. I mean, this came through Dorothy.
It came
through his mother.
From Dorothy.
It came through his father. They were, old blue blood Southerners, that genteel kind of noblesse oblige racism. And he absorbed that very deeply. And it's important also to point out, before going to Subiaco, when you witnessed this, or your classmates witnessed this side of Frank, I hesitate to call it a performative moment, but there was a performative quality to it. It seems like the way he was performing the racism. He was coming from Mountain Home, where there were, when I interviewed people in Mountain Home about the racial tension in Mountain Home, they said, "Oh, none," because black people were not allowed in Mountain Home. There were no black people in Mountain Home. And that's where Frank had been for many years before coming. And so you combine his upbringing with Dorothy and his father and this kind of, genteel, lost cause, Old South racism with the ethic of Mountain Home. And there was actually some racial tension in Mountain Home because the Baxter Laboratories there had brought in highly educated black workers from Chicago who were driven out very quickly. And so, Frank shows up, he meets Bill Money from Mississippi, and he starts identifying with Mississippi. And so, I mean, it was real, but it was also exaggerated in a performative way with the Confederate flag and wearing the Confederate cap and the signatures that he put in the yearbooks about, don't forget the values of the Old South as you head up there to, Yankee Land kind of thing.
Robert E. Lee.
And so, I think the only way to face this is head on and just say, look, like, this is what Frank thought. This is how he behaved. You sure as hell don't excuse it. But it does put his conversion, which was thoroughly genuine. There's no way you can read The Battlefield and not get the sense that you're reading the work of a zealous convert.
What age was he at, that conversion?
Well, I would argue it really took place between 1968 and 1972. Is when
hit. What age was he at that?
Oh, how old was he? So 20 to 22.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it's a big part of Frank's story. And I mean, Leo in his book lays the baseline for this very well. And to me, it highlights the significance and the sort of dramatic nature of his conversion, the shift in thinking.
So I assume that Fayetteville is the most, and in that era, was the most liberal city in Arkansas. But
that's
it's
not
not as if Arkansas were not a deeply polarized state.
2% of the population.
President Eisenhower desegregated Little Rock in 1954 using troops under the Insurrection Act.
So when Frank was at the university, they started the Black Studies program, which pissed off white people. They tried to allow blacks to finally go to football games and sit with whites. They got that pissed off people. Racial tensions were high at this time. When Frank was going to Sherman's, he was going to Sherman's at a time when racial violence and racial tensions were as high as they had ever been, openly in Fayetteville. So a discussion was going on. It was a deeply stressful, intense discussion.
There was a college football coach named Frank
Royals. Yeah.
Right, who was legend. And when did that team desegregate?
69 maybe? I don't know. A little bit of trivia, though. I can't help but do this, but Jim Whitehead, who I mentioned as Frank's teacher, when Jim died, his wife, Gim Whitehead, married Frank Royals. Yeah.
Wow.
Small town. Really.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was a weird situation back then, and researching it was weird for me too. We had one black boarder at Subiaco, one African American boarder from Memphis, which is where Frank, had lived a good part of his childhood. And Frank never really acknowledged. His name's Emmett Hawkins. He's one of the two people to whom the book is dedicated, and which was a shame because they probably crossed paths. You taught me that the black baseball team was that the games were integrated. The people who sat in the stands were integrated. The team was not integrated. In the 50s, yeah. So it's possible that Frank and Emmett were at the same games. At some point. I would say, not necessarily in Frank's defense, but to understand it, there must have been some kind of inner conflict going on in him, because I really do believe, he not only played with those, he probably loved those black kids that he grew up with, and certainly respected the black employees of his family in Memphis.
Charlie B. Lemon.
And at the same time, after Mountain Home, I'm just going to go ahead and blame some of it on Mountain Home. Fit in Mountain Home, he had to behave in the way that he behaved at Subiaco, I think. But the other thing I will say in defense of Subiaco is that Subiaco really was starting to push back, on any kind of racist behavior in the students, and we did the Catholic organization in Chicago. It's called Friendship House. It's actually a really interesting organization that is defunct now, but it was active from the 40s, I think, into the 70s, and they were connected with Dorothy Day, and they really helped Subiaco develop a curriculum, that addressed these things. And one of the programs was to go and visit black homes in black families in Fort Smith and Pine Bluff. And I am pretty sure that Frank did not go on those visits. You weren't required to, but there are photographs in the school paper of us boys in the homes of these black people, and the articles talk about some students being very receptive to what they heard and saw and the conversations they had. Others, Frank was not the only one who really resisted any kind of acclamation.
And there's a couple things also that I would add to this. Sorry, can I
go ahead.
Okay, so back to Dave, your question, how old was he? 20. Something else was happening at that age too, which I think factors into this transition away from Mountain Home, Subiaco thinking about race, to Fayetteville thinking about race. And he depending on who you want to listen to, he either discovered that he was adopted, or he finally acknowledged the reality of his adoption. And I see it more as he rather didn't discover it, he knew all along, but he acknowledged the reality of his adoption. When he got to Fayetteville and realized, I don't want to go into the business school and be in a fraternity like my parents want me, like my mother wants me to do. His father was dead at that point. I don't want to do that. I want to actually be a poet. So he goes and leaves the business school and starts taking poetry classes. And then he's like, oh, and by the way, I was adopted. That whole past that had influenced him is gone. Poof. And that's when he starts going to Sherman. So it's almost like he had to shed that history. Literally, lop that history off to free him to start pursuing the kind of values that he pursued. The other thing I would add about Subiaco was, I did talk to Emmett, and I know you did as well, but we both talked to Emmett Hawkins, the one black guy in your class.
He was the one border, there was one student too.
And, there was still some resentment there. There was still a kind of acknowledgement that, he told me that Frank was racist, and he said he added more racist than most, actually. So,
one quick comment, and then I saw you had a question. I love, James, that you brought up the connection there to the adoption discovery or rediscovery or whatever. I do just want to point out one of the contributions of your book. Before this came out, I think that the dominant narrative about Stanford's adoption was that he discovered he was adopted after leaving high school, and that's what I believe, that's what I heard from others. And you found fantastic evidence in the poetry, in the life, that showed, no, he in fact knew all along. My favorite was in the Blue Yodel poem. I think it was Blue Yodel of those who were always telling me, when he says, I just felt sorry for you because you didn't have any folks, which seems to be a kind of reflexive comment. So that was just phenomenal. But you had a question.
Well, first of all, I have about 20 things gobbled up in my brain right now that I want to address.
Oh, we got all night. We're going to be here all night. It's fine. Yeah, take your time.
So I have to say right away, just because of what you said, Hayden, is that, thank the poetry gods that he didn't end up in New York, because we would not see all of the string of poems called Blue Yodel of this, Blue Yodel of that. Tons of them in there. They're just magnificent. So there's that. Thank you for dispelling the myth around his death. This is another thing in my brain right now, because you read how he went into the room and C.D. Wright was there, the three of them were there, and then he went into a room and shot himself in the heart 3 times.
Yeah.
How do you shoot yourself in the heart 3 times? You don't. He shot himself in his chest.
Yeah.
It found its way.
Yeah.
But then the other thing I want to mention is the battlefield poem, because I know that initially it was over 1,000 pages, and then it was honed down to over 500 pages, and then his collected came out, which is a wonderful, brilliant book.
Yeah.
I love it. And what the editor did was to take snippets of the battlefield poem and disperse them all throughout the book. And I can't help but ask, what the hell would he leave out of that?
He would have hated it.
Yes.
I did. And anyone who's read The Battlefield will hate it.
And where's the rest, right? And I just can't believe
So who was that editor?
I don't want to disparage the editor at all, because putting this book out was a
including
game
the
changer.
ending of the battlefield was really important. He couldn't put the whole thing in because nobody would have been able to afford to buy the book.
Right.
But but doing it that way was very odd in my mind.
I would agree with you. I'd say worse than odd, but because it's a narrative epic, and reading it in snippets like that is in some ways alienating, because you don't really know what's going on. The language is way out of context. Good time to plug the project. So I'm co-editing the 3rd edition of The Battlefield, which comes out in early 2026, and because it's the 2nd edition's out of print right now, so very hard to get hold of.
So how much of the battlefield is going to be in this?
I'm co-editing the whole battlefield,
And then some.
No, actually, no, not the whole battlefield, and then some, because I found 270 lines that never made it in. I worked with the original typescript. I found over 1,000 errors and over 200 lines that never made it in. So it will be a slightly different tone. And I've also written summaries for every 10-page summaries of the stories. So,
Okay, you've been busy.
Jared,
I just I don't want to continue to harp on one subject, but I thought it was interesting when you talked about his experiences of his conversion from being, kind of a homegrown racist back in the day to someone who really explored the black vernacular, who tried to be one of those voices trying to stand up for the black, stand with the black. I hate when people say stand up for, stand with the black community. But question: in part of his journey in that conversion, was it just from finding out about his adoption or exposure to other arts, or was he also, as he was influenced by Faulkner, was he also influenced by some of the black poets of that time as well, like Baldwin, or even earlier as like Jordan and Lord and all that?
No, he really wasn't. I found very little evidence of that. You would think. I mean, it's a completely fair assumption. The question of influence in Frank is really actually difficult. He was a poet, I think, more than most, who just listened to what was happening around him. Like his ear, we haven't really talked much about his ear. It really gravitated to language that was fresh, that was different.
In a way, the people in that tavern, that black-owned tavern business, probably were more of inspiration than the black.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think if you want to think about where is that coming from, I do think it's like a genuine curiosity for in some ways sort of slightly alien vernaculars. And this explains his interest in the French poets and the Spanish poets and the Japanese poets as well. It just hit his ear in a different way.
Jerry.
How many students were at Subiaco?
In our class, there were 50 in the senior class, and overall, a little over 200 at the time.
Overall, 200.
Overall,
And
freshmen
was it
through
usual
senior
setup
class.
for 3 guys in a room? Was that a typical setup?
The upperclassmen, juniors, and seniors had the option to have. I mean, most of them did have private rooms, but there were triples and doubles. I think mostly doubles, as I was always in a double.
This may sound stupid. Could you have a record player?
Yes, yeah,
Could.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Because Frank seems to be very influenced by music.
Yeah, I don't know if he had his records at Subiaco. He might have kept them at his mother's house. So his mother worked at Subiaco. She ran the retreat center there. But yeah, his record collection still exists. It's owned. It's actually I don't know if you say owned or the caretaker of it is the manager of the Whitewater Tavern in Little Rock.
Wow. Awesome.
Yeah. And it's a fabulous record collection. I mean, you sure.
Could you talk about just a few of some of what those influences might have been?
Blues. I mean, blues, jazz. He listened to a lot of classical music as well.
I mean, he had Lightning Hopkins, so he definitely had black musicians
Yeah,
too.
yeah. I mean,
Joni Mitchell, Constant Stranger, right?
Yeah, Joni Mitchell was in there, but the vast majority of the records were by black musicians. Yeah. And that's something we haven't brought up, but the blues tradition, that's actually a better way to have answered your question, not just what he was hearing, but the blues tradition. Because you read his poems, you hear, I mean, he actually recycles a lot of blues lyrics.
Right.
Furry Lewis in
I could see that,
particular, Robert Johnson, yeah.
So, since we're delving into popular music, I guess I have to ask you both this question, because I discussed this with Aiden when the article came out. So you mentioned Lucinda Williams, who's like a goddess to me. But for a long time. And so about 2.5, maybe 3 years ago, in the New Yorker, she did a piece. Now, one of her most famous songs, Piniella, is about Stanford. And so I wanted to get your take on that article if you read it. And, I'm just going to summarize her narrative. She covers a lot of the last days. She met him fairly late in his life, but she was on the verge of becoming yet his second, she was about to enter something like a quadruple with C.D. Wright and with his second wife, which would have been, the stuff of a Woody Allen movie, although not a comedy. But did you read it, and what was your take on her take?
Yeah. So this is the excerpt from her memoir, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
All right. So this is super insider baseball, but I actually fact checked it before it ran because there were questions about just details about Frank's life.
Wow.
Yeah. So I thought it was, to be honest, I thought the memoir was really boring. And I love Lucinda Williams. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I wanted more than just the men that she was making mistakes with, and I found it to be too much of that. But in terms of her take on Frank, I think it was right on the money. She liked the rebellious poet, the intellectual on a motorcycle is I think what she said was her ideal man, and that was Frank. But she also, they were never intimate, which is, but I think you're absolutely right that they were on the verge of moving in that direction. And in fact, so early in Frank's life, before C.D. and Jenny, it was 2 other women. He was married to Linda Menson and living with and having an affair with a woman named Cher Campbell. For a good 9 months, he pulled this off. So he was practiced before he went into the C.D. and Jenny triangle. I actually saw a new situation emerging because he had such a good time in New Orleans. He talked about getting a place in New Orleans. And I think it would have been Kay Duvernay, the woman I mentioned in the opening, and Lucinda. I think that's where he was, where the next triangle was going to come from. But I think your instincts are right on that. But they had a really vibrant. Frank was, I think, very, very appealing to a lot of women on this point. But when you talked about your art with him, he made you feel like the center of the world. I mean, and said what you needed to hear. And made you feel like you were going to be the most famous poet and musician and painter ever.
He did that.
And he was right. And he was right.
Right.
CD, look at where she went.
Right.
Jenny painted the White House portrait of Hillary Clinton and Lucinda.
Right. Well, I mean, Lucinda was Miller Williams, who was the poet laureate of Arkansas and
Frank?
poet. Yeah, Frank. Right, Miller Williams.
Yeah, I mean,
was
Frank
her dad.
Miller's
and he was kind of, king of the hill in Fayetteville, and ended up. Didn't he give Bill Clinton's? He was he was the poet, inaugural poet for Bill Clinton. Not a man of. And Fayetteville was a definite lane. I mean, I was very young then, but there was Ellen Dugan,
Alan visited.
Dick Gilchrist. I mean, there was a whole circle of people in Fayetteville around Miller Williams, which includes Stanford. But that was like a center. There are different centers of American poetry. San Francisco, New York School. After Creeley and Olson moved to Buffalo, right? So there were like all these people kind of, coherent, congealing.
Yeah,
but so he was, but I gather he was the best, the most talented.
Frank was a legend in Fayetteville. I mean, he still is a legend in Fayetteville.
But
Can I ask about something about that? And this is for all three of you. This idea of him being the sort of poet laureate of Arkansas, and this is very fascinating for me because many of you might be people who passionately know everything about him. I know nothing about him except that my good buddy Jimmy wrote this book. So I'm always very, very interested in, for example, I went to the writing program at Columbia University where Jack Kerouac famously went. I am not really that much of a Jack Kerouac fan, especially because Jack Kerouac was such a Jack Kerouac fan. And he always needed to be in places where, he often needed to be in places where people knew that he was sort of the king. My question to possibly everybody here, or the three of you up there, is how long into his career was it when he was sort of benighted in this way, and did he physically spend his time around people who really, really knew his work, or was he in any way a recluse when he was doing his work? Right? And because that's something that I've talking to you over the last 2 years, I've learned a lot, but that's something that I don't know, and to what extent did it influence his work?
Great questions.
Okay, yeah. So he published The Singing Knives in 1972. And when that came out, it was a big hit in Fayetteville, but he wasn't living in Fayetteville
At the time.
He was living, in 1972, he was living part of the time in Subiaco with his mother. He had been living in, well, that's not entirely true. He was living up on Mount Sequoia outside of Fayetteville. But when it came out, when it came out in the summer of 72, he was away from Fayetteville. He went to New York for a month. He came back and lived in Subiaco for a while. He wound up in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, then Rogers, Arkansas, and he met Jenny. And he never moved back to Fayetteville and with CD until 1976. So
really just a couple
this
years
actually
before he
makes your
died.
question really significant, because while he was away from Fayetteville, his reputation, because he had 3 books come out in 75, his reputation just started to grow and grow and grow. And then, people are like, where's Frank Stanford? And then he starts...
Well, I literally know,
Then he starts...
I literally know of no other poet who has had that kind of... it's fascinating that he was that big. How many people lived in Fayetteville, would you say, around that time?
Oh, I should know
Fewer
that.
than 100,000, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
70,000.
maybe around that.
I'm
Okay.
guessing, really, because I don't know. It's a small city.
Yeah, like 60 to 70,000. But no, so when he came back, it was like one guy I interviewed who was in Fayetteville said it was like Marco Polo coming
Did it
back.
tame the madness at all? Was he happy at all when all this happened? And
Well, I think he loved it.
Oh, okay.
Well, and there were versions of this his whole life, right? I mean, he was his mother's favorite. He was the darling of the levee camps. He was the hotshot of Lake Norfolk.
Yeah.
He was Subiaco's poet laureate, and he's a legend in Fayetteville.
Okay.
So, but he's always running away from these things.
This is a
Well,
Which
he
you
was
got there.
Subiaco's judo master. Really.
Yeah, that too.
Actually, more even than a poet. He was known and respected for founding the judo club and really making it into a sport at the high school, which it had never been before, and so that was a big deal. And I'm sure he thrived on that too. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think he enjoyed being the star,
Yeah.
and he was. Even in Mountain Home, he was a fishing guide, and he was, God, this research was so insane. Like, I found his fishing records, like from like 1961, and here are these, anglers coming in from all over the country, and they would list the top 10 fish caught every day, and like Frank Stanford, number 3, this like 11, 12-year-old kid, and he was he loved it. He loved that.
Yeah.
I have another question about the poetry. So I was raised in San Francisco, but my mother was from Tennessee, and I grew up with all these like Southern stories, right? There's storytellers, people from the South, and there's so much in that, in his poetry. And the one poem that really always sticks out for me is about someone leaving their dog in a truck, and then people coming out from a bar, seeing it, pulling the dog out. The dog ends up being shot, right? And then the guy who owns the dog, at the end of the poem, the way he takes care of it is to drive to the house where these men live and sit in the car looking at the house until their wives looked out the window. End of poem. That is such a Southern Gothic type of aesthetic, and again, thank you for not going to New York. But I wonder how many of these stories are true experiences, true stories, or if his imagination just went off. Do you have any idea?
Because it's funny because Leo and I talked about this, about how to describe Frank's poems, and the first thing you said was narrative.
Yeah, I actually grew up in the Mississippi Delta myself, actually more than Frank, because I was not there only in the summers. I was there all the time in Lake Providence, Louisiana, Mississippi. And, I had the town is called Lake Providence. It's still 85% African American. And I think that, sorry, what was where were we?
Well, this whole thing, like, was this real? Were these images?
Oh, yeah.
Were these images real? Were these narratives real, or just pure imagination?
Coming back to the poetry, I was telling James again today. I think I told him. I repeated myself probably, but when I first started to read the poetry, I found that Frank was saying things, describing characters, events that I had either mostly not experienced, but fantasized about, thought about. I mean, when he talks about the way a minnow looks when you stick a hook in it, and things I mean, those were things that really just got to me, in a way that I couldn't articulate directly, but I thought was very real and very intense. And my view is that a lot of this stuff came out of his febrile imagination. I don't think he was hanging around with black guys on the levee who were throwing knives at one another. I doubt seriously if that happened, but maybe
I mean, my take is that it's closer to experience and stories that he had heard.
Yeah.
He would become very angry. The only time I really sort of found him angry in his letters was when editors would say, "Well, this is implausible," or "This is too surreal. This is too surreal. It's too much." And he hated being called surreal because his take on it was, no, like, you New York editors need to get out more. Like, maybe go beyond Brooklyn and
question on that. Was he mad that they were telling him he's too surreal, or the fact that they were trying to say surreal was a bad thing?
No, they weren't saying surreal was a bad thing.
Oh.
They just thought this was
So he
somebody
hated
who went
the
and
term
watched too
surreal.
much Cocteau movies and started to write Cocteau versions of the Deep South or the Backwoods South. And I think Frank was a surveyor. You have to understand, like, this guy covered thousands of miles and encountered thousands of people and heard thousands of stories, and I'm convinced almost everything he wrote came from something that he witnessed or heard. The autobiographical loyalty of the battlefield is something that I think still needs to be built out a bit, but it's very much there. So that's my take. I mean, there's certainly, he had a fiery imagination.
No, I yield to that.
Yeah.
I definitely think that's possible. I mean, he, especially, I mean, since he had that fantastic memory, the things that he heard when he was a small child, Levy from the other kids, from the black kids, but also from the adults that were there. I mean, that would have been a trove of stories that would last him a long time, probably, right?
Yeah, for sure. And he has these great moments in the battlefield where there's one where a New York editor comes down looking for stories. Stories in the South. And Francis, the protagonist, who's Frank, says, "You want a story? Like, well, go get yourself snake bit." And the guy's like, "Well, that's a great idea. Yeah, go put your hand under that dock right there." The guy gets snake bit, and he's got a story. And so it's Frank's poking fun at these guys.
It's shocking to hear. I mean, to me, it's surprising to hear that he hated being called a surrealist.
Hated is too strong of a word, but he graded against it. Yeah.
And yet there's the tinge of surrealism in his work. I mean, you can put him aside Laureate in some aspects.
There's
a tinge, not a whole shitload.
I think he just wanted to make the point that what I see on a daily basis, I think he really prided himself on hearing and seeing crazy shit, and that only happens in the deep South or in Northwest Arkansas or in these pockets that are sort of not urban and not especially literary or sophisticated. And so when literary people said, "No, this is surreal," he said, "Well, it's more grounded in reality than you might actually be aware."
So I have a final sort of provocation, but I want to hold it in case there are any closing questions from the rest of the folks here. Anybody else? Yeah.
So, I want to thank the three of you and someone who's regrettably not with us any longer, C.D. Wright. So, I'm younger than Stanford. I was born in 55, he was born in 49. I came up through the Buffalo poetry scene at that time, and I had a chance to write about poetry for a long time. So, his reputation, once you die, you're gone, and you're not doing readings. You're not. The MFA world didn't exist in 1978 to the extent that it does now, when writers go on tour, right? So, there are a bunch of really great regional, southern, southwestern writers who rose at about the same time. Stanford is the poet, but there were also, what is his name? John Kennedy Toole.
Oh, yeah.
Cormac McCarthy's student who wrote The Confederacy of Dunces, A Confederacy of Dunces, an amazing book.
One of my favorites, yeah.
He killed himself. Brice de Japancake, who was a friend of Jane Ann Phillips, somebody I do know well, who died suddenly. Cormac McCarthy, very much in his early work, very Faulkner-esque, more of a right-wing guy, and eventually pared his style down and became the novelist of our time. So here we are, you and Franz Wright, we should have thrown his name in here too, because he also championed Stanford's work.
Yeah.
But, Stanford's kind of forgotten 20 years ago, and CD probably because she really had access through her achievements to the mainstream of American poetry. She kind of hauled Frank out of the grave. I don't know how you discovered Frank Stanford.
Jerry Crinan, right behind you.
Okay. Well,
he was my teacher at Brown University.
Well, there you go, at Brown. Okay, so that's it. that's it. At Brown. Well, Brown is big. Brown is, one of the creative writing centers in America. So, but it kind of fits an archetype in American letters. And in that same archetype, that kind of tortured young genius, Hart Crane, Delmore Schwartz, need I go on? Right? I knew Richard Brautigan a little bit. This is a little different story. He killed himself when he was 47. I actually brought him to Buffalo, and I was his chaperone for
I
a week.
remember you telling me that story.
You don't want to
That
know
must be a story. You should be on.
but the point is, so these lives are exemplary lives for us. And, I think, to be honest with you, more for young male writers than for young women, like how they negotiate these first major issues in their lives. Had he lived, I thought he might become a novelist, really. But, he would be in his late 70s, early 80s today.
77.
Yesterday.
Okay. So, had he resolved whatever conflicts in his life, or was he were there so inherently many contradictions within his soul that it was just a matter of time? Or might he have, become a creative writing professor and,
No.
No.
Probably not.
So the question then is an alternative future for Stanford. What is that right? Like, what if he hadn't died? Where would he be, and where would his legacy be? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's
What do you think,
basic.
guys?
Oh, and moreover, what do you think his legacy is in American letters?
We're working on that.
Right.
Work in
I think
progress,
it's
yeah.
undervalued, but I have my sense. We've talked about it. What do you think Frank would have done? I mean, we can play that basis. You can't be wrong. So,
I have thought about it a lot, I guess, over the last decade. I think he would not feel at home in the world that we have now. I think the internet, social media, things. There is a kind of, however much Frank was performative, as we say now, he was leading for himself a very authentic, imaginative life, which I think is very difficult for anybody, and certainly for poets too. If you're reduced to getting your income from teaching in an MFA program, which God bless the fact that we have them, I think Frank, and maybe this is romanticizing him, I think he was one of those poets, one of those creative people. There are a lot of historical examples too, Lermontov and the Russian writer, and there's an Austrian writer who is actually the same age as Frank and I, N.C. Kaiser, that I was telling James about the other day, who led the same kind of life. He drank himself to death rather than actually, shooting himself. And he wrote a very similar kind of poetry, just absolutely seemed to come out of nowhere. And I think that Frank probably wouldn't have made the transition. I don't know, but I think he would have gone to prose. I agree with that. I think he was maybe at the end of writing poetry, and
he was writing it all along.
Yeah, and an epic is, the original meaning of epic, has to do with the story, right? With the narrative story. In a way, the story is more important than the verse anyway, or than the poem. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just seeing him as as a tragic figure, but I don't see how he would have made the transition.
I think Frank was getting closer and closer to, and he made a film, but he was getting closer and closer to making a transition from poetry to filmmaking. And there was a friend of his who was trying to get him to come out to UCLA, who was in the program out there, a guy named Jim Babbage, who wanted Frank to come out there and get into the film business. And Frank was deeply knowledgeable of film and film history. He had a theater for a while in Eureka Springs. So I think that's where he was going. But in some ways, I also think the question is undermined by the fact that he had no intention of living past 30. And I just found some quotes from his poetry going way back. And it's worth noting that in 1970, I think he told his best friend Bill Willett that like, I'm not going to live past 30. I had no intention of living past 30.
Why?
He dreaded adulthood. He loved childhood. He loved the idea of childhood, the freedom of childhood, and he dreaded what becoming an adult did to the people that he saw around him. Here's read you some quotes. A rifle in my hand, this is often his poetry. A rifle in my hand, a bullet in my heart. I can go get my pistol anytime. I've come to know the timing of my own death. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down myself. Alive, I announce my own death to the world of the living. A person might have thought 3 shots were fired. I, who will be dead before one word is read, a suicide note which is sung too late. I mean, he knew he was going to kill himself a long time before he did it. And so that's a much deeper and more mysterious question. And I don't have the answer to it for sure.
There was somebody, I can't think who it was, who once referred to him, probably disparagingly, but I'm not sure. To me, it sounds like a compliment. They once referred to Stanford as a swamp rat Rambo.
Yeah, it was Lorenzo Thomas.
Yeah.
It was a compliment.
Definitely a
It was
compliment,
a compliment, but I mean, so the reason I posed the question was that, Rimbaud, actually stopped writing poetry and moved away.
Yeah.
And
business.
is it possible to imagine that this is like a movie,
So
maybe
It's
an
almost
hour
been a
or
movie
so.
several times, yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of
So
stuff
when I
in
say
Star
Frank
Projects.
hated adulthood, he wasn't an adult for 3 years. He was an adult from 1973 to early 1976. He was financially stable. He was living with his wife. She was painting. He was writing poetry. He was surveying. They had 2 cats. He quit drinking. And he couldn't keep doing it. It was too dull.
So the last thing I want to say, and I said this is a provocation. There's maybe a question nested in here, but often when folks gather to talk about Frank Stanford, eventually we end up talking about why Frank Stanford isn't better known and why this room isn't packed right now. And it's a complicated question. I know our friend Adam Walton will be quick to point out that there is not a single Norton anthology that has any Stanford poems included. For a poet of this significance who was beloved and championed by so many poets who are part of the firmament today, like Forrest Gander, C.D. Wright, Allen Ginsberg, and so many others, why is he not better known? And I have to say, James, your book nudged my thinking along on this topic, and I wondered if you could expand on this. I think when we think about the sort of machinery of canonization, I think often of T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which describes this kind of pyramid of world literature. And when someone comes up and is like good enough to get in, we sort of rearrange the blocks. And the way American poetry works is, at least in the 20th century, it's regionalized or broken up by schools. And so if a poet like a Frank Stanford would come along and the machinery would work for him, it would be like, all right, Faulkner, take a couple steps to the left, and Flannery O'Connor, take a step to the right, and we'll fit Frank Stanford in there. That just doesn't work for Frank Stanford's poetry because he's way too frickin' big. He would obliterate the canon. I think that's why. What do you think about that?
No, I think that's absolutely fair. But I think there's a couple things that come to mind. One, he did subvert his own opportunities of being canonized by making the publishing choices that he made. And in 1971, he had the opportunity to publish The Singing Knives with Random House. He had an editor named Eleanor Bender who wanted to essentially agent his work and had a contact at Random House who was interested. But she said, send me 50 poems and we'll let the editor chisel it down to 25 or 30. And Frank said, oh no, I'm not going to allow somebody else to make decisions for me. Good. I'm not ready for that. Yeah. Right, good, fine. So he goes with Irv Broughton, Mill Mountain Press. Irv says, Frank, whatever you want. You want gas money? You got it. You want the cover to look like what? You got it. Anything you want. And great, but Irv was taking out loans on his gas card to get these books published.
Mill Mountain Press was a one-person operation publishing one poet. Technically, that's not true, but it's almost true. He published one person before Frank Stanford. Otherwise, the only poet published by Mill Mountain was Frank Stanford. Distribution, none. 250, 500 copies at the most. So you can publish poems in the little magazines, and those go poof pretty quickly. It's the books that stick around and make your reputation and get you canonized. And Frank published 9 books in the course of his life, and nobody saw them outside of Fayetteville. And so I think there is actually a kind of empirical reason for this, and I think a lot of it is due to his immaturity and unwillingness to lose control. I mean, I agree with you. Good. Don't lose control of your poetry, but the consequences are you're not going to get canonized. Now, when he died, CD, as was indicated, she went to bat. She started writing editors left and right at every major publication.
Did Viking
saying,
Press pick up one of his edits too? Viking Press is pretty big and out of New York. I mean, that's
did they publish something that maybe one of his poems got into? I'm not
no,
sure.
they published one of his edited, one of his books re-edited by Viking Press or something.
Well, there was the Selected in '90, but that was not from Viking. That was from Arkansas. Yeah.
I could have sworn I saw something Viking Press.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
But no, CD tried all these presses, and she said, you need to do a retrospective on this poet, and essentially try to revive these books in bigger venues so people can hear about them, and maybe they can go back into print. And nobody did. Nobody picked up the thread. And then she'd write them letters saying, "What the fuck is wrong with you? This guy, she got really angry. She really did advocate with him." There's a great article to be written there about that effort.
Yeah. Publishing ecosystem was a lot different in the 60s, 70s, and 80s than it is now.
Yeah.
I mean, no major publisher, unless you already have, an annual book award or critics, unless you already won a major award or something, is going to touch a poet of any reputation.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it may all be changing now. I'm conscious that we've been here. Yeah, go ahead.
Made this into a movie, and it all changes because it is the whole thing is cinematic.
Oliver
Oh,
Stone.
shit! This is yours. That's a screenwriter back there. So this is a movie, a great movie. So
I
then
think so.
all it takes is one movie, and
So-
then he's famous. Everybody knows him.
So
I have a
Stanford biopic.
I have a better
I think-
director,
Yeah.
Werner Herzog. I actually sent him.
no,
You
I
did.
think-
I sent him the collected poems. I have not sent him the biography. I haven't had time, but I will. Get it.
You heard it here first, folks.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
He might do it. Who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that there's already a film
Right.
by and about Frank, I think, would really
I
entice.
finally met someone crazier than I am.
There is.
No, there's not, but we hope there will be. Yeah. But all right, folks, thanks for coming. Let me quickly say there are books on sale, both books that you heard about tonight. And for anyone who buys either one of those, one of you'll be automatically entered into a raffle for a pretty pristine first edition cover, unbound, of The Battlefield When the Moon Says I Love You, which we have here. So stick around, buy the books, get them signed, chat, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.